Okay, well, good afternoon to all of you. My name is Walter Edwards. I'll just go ahead and give my brief introduction. Patrick is a very modest young man. We asked him for a long bio, and he gave us just one sentence, which says that he is an assistant professor in urban studies and planning at Wayne State University. And his research interests include shrinking cities, planning, history, parks and public spaces, government, urban governance, and racial equity. And he gave the name of his talk, the title of his talk today, the Shrinking City in Regional Perspective, Population and Household Loss in Metropolitan Detroit, 1920 to 2010. But I wouldn't let it go at that. I just had to go on his department's website, and I saw that he is a Wolverine through and through. He got his Bachelor's of Arts from University of Michigan in 2010, and his Master's in Public Planning from the University of Michigan in 2014, and his PhD in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Michigan in 2019. And he joined us as an assistant professor soon after that, and he had been with us as an instructor since 2017. He is already published. He has an article published in the Journal of Planning History, published in 2019, entitled Negotiating the Post-Industrial City. He also has an article published in 2016, also in the Journal of Planning History, entitled The Trap of Triage, Lessons from the Team 4 Plan. And he and several other people have an article in an edited collection entitled Reinventing Detroit, The Politics of Possibility. That article is entitled Learning from Detroit, How Research on a Declining City Enriches Urban Studies. So we're in the presence of a scholar at the beginning of his career, and I'm sure that the prospects and the promise is very rich. So please welcome to the virtual podium, Professor Patrick Cooper.
Thank you very much for your extra research and giving me an excellent introduction.
Yes.
So I'm hoping that today's talk will live up to that title of that book chapter from a few years ago, Learning from Detroit, how knowledge about a declining city can teach us something about urban studies generally. So the title of my talk is The Shrinking City in Regional Perspective, Population and Household Loss in Metro Detroit, 1920 to 2010. And the goal of the talk is to kind of share with you the results of a project I've been working on now for over a year, I would say, trying to kind of reconceptualize how we think about shrinking cities in general and how we talk about Detroit as a shrinking city, to move beyond the focus, kind of singular focus on just the city of Detroit, and to position this as a regional phenomenon, but with varying levels of intensity, and try to tease out some of the kind of different factors that contribute to population and household loss, and why we see the kind of patterns that we do. Before I start, I just want to give kind of credit where credit is due. So first off, I have a great research assistant, Andrew Jason, who is a Master of Urban Planning student, and he made all the maps that you're going to see, working closely with me, and also scanned some of the historical figures that I'll show you. And this project has also been supported with 2 grants from Wayne State. One is a Arts and Humanities Research Grant from OBPR, and the other is a Humanities Center Faculty Fellowship. And I'll be presenting this with a little bit more detail again, I think in about a month at the Faculty Fellowship Conference. So there's certain things I'm still analyzing and you can stay tuned for those at the next presentation. So today's talk is going to kind of have three parts. First, I'm going to do kind of a brief kind of theory about, how and why would a place shrink? I want to kind of start with an understanding of what is it we're talking about when we're talking about shrinking cities, and what are some of the kind of causal factors, and why would it? How does it help us explain what I will follow with is the analysis of, if we look back at historical population and household data for Metro Detroit over the last century, which communities have lost people? Which communities have lost households? For how long? Why? What's driving these trends? And then I will conclude with some possible implications for research and for policy. These are kind of fresh. I'm just kind of, just recently finished putting together the data set, and I'm still kind of teasing out some of this. So I'd be interested to hear what you all think the implications of this, or how this changes your understanding of Detroit as a shrinking city. So the broad research question that I'm engaging with is, what is a shrinking city in the United States? This term, if you have heard of this, sometimes people say legacy city instead, kind of came up in the mid-2000s amidst an effort to draw commonality between cities experiencing population loss in Europe and in the United States. And then it kind of expanded its scope to look all around the world and see how many cities are actually losing population, not gaining population, and why. But it has kind of opened up a big debate amongst those engaging in research on this topic about what it is we actually mean when we say a shrinking city. And so I just want to give you some of the contours of that debate before I show you how I'm approaching it. So the initial discussion around this topic focused primarily on population loss. But it's become clear that that's not the only kind of variable of interest. You can modestly lose, you can see modest population loss in a city over time without any visible sign of decline. And the motivation for this research was initially in response to places like Detroit, where decline is so evident and so enduring. And so the question is, well, how should we measure it? Is it just a question about population loss? Is it about occupied housing and households? Is it, do you need to think about economic changes, about income levels, about property values, about the fiscal capacity of local governments? There are debates about kind of thresholds. What if a place loses population for a few years and then bounces back? Was it briefly a shrinking city? Does that dilute the concept? Is there a kind of length of time that should be required to attach this label to a place? Do we want to limit the analysis of shrinking cities to places that have evidently experienced some form of decline, like physical deterioration or impoverishment? Or should we study the full range of places experiencing population and household loss, regardless of kind of the effects? Is city the right scale? Many of the research studies on this topic attempt to put together a kind of national data set, we'll say, or maybe regional. Like if we look at all the big cities in the Midwest and we drop everything below 50,000, because those are small, and we take that data set, which of these are shrinking? As opposed to taking a regional approach like I'm going to today, or digging down to the neighborhood scale, which was a common way to analyze decline previously. And then how should we talk about it? Is shrinking city a stigmatizing label? Is it something that we should avoid saying? Is legacy city better? Is there another way to talk about it? How do you translate this work from kind of research into policy in a way that planners and policymakers and elected officials are comfortable talking about it? So that's the debate. What I'm proposing in this project kind of came to both from reading other research literature and from examining the data that I'm looking at, kind of making sense of the patterns I'm seeing, is that you really need to start with understanding that there are three distinct drivers of population loss. So if you look at any geography, we're talking about neighborhood, a city, you can experience population loss on its own without a corresponding loss of housing. You can experience population loss because there are fewer houses than there were previously, and therefore there's fewer places for people to live. And you can experience population loss because there aren't sufficient number of households to occupy the housing that exists. Now, these are interrelated, and I'm going to explain each one in more detail, but this is kind of key to my understanding of the patterns I'm going to show you in a few minutes. So population loss alone is the primary form of population loss that we see throughout the United States and in Metro Detroit. And the logic of this is pretty simple. So, a neighborhood maybe starts long ago as farmland, and it gets subdivided, streets get laid down, and housing gets built. Once that neighborhood is built out, if no additional construction takes place, if the units aren't getting subdivided, once it's kind of plateaued, population loss is expected, not unexpected, for two reasons. One is that there's a long-term trend in the US and across other developed countries of smaller families. Families are having fewer children, and we also have fewer married couples than we once did. We also have more young people living independently, so you're not just going from home to getting married to moving on to your new family, but there's a period in your 20s when you're on your own. And we also have more seniors and older adults living on their own. So we have more individual households and we have smaller families. And so if you have a fixed number of housing units in a neighborhood, and that community ages and experiences these broad trends of smaller families, you're going to have fewer people over time. And in fact, you can see a steady population loss, even if on the margins, the number of households keeps increasing. So even if there is a little bit of additional housing construction, you would still find that population could fall. So that's kind of the first layer of population loss, and it's closely correlated with the age of the neighborhood. When did that neighborhood get built out? And then kind of a clock starts ticking and population starts to trend downward. The second form of population loss is related to housing loss. Literally, houses are gone, and therefore there are fewer spaces to occupy. You can't have as many households in the neighborhood because there aren't as many housing units. So where did the housing units go? What causes housing units to disappear? A few things. One is replacement of multifamily housing with single-family housing. If you take a duplex and convert it to single family, you've gone from 2 housing units to 1. Another trend is conversion to non-residential use. So sometimes something that was a house gets turned into an office or something else, or a restaurant. Another factor is destruction over time. Houses get hit by tornadoes, they catch fire, they get flooded, they suffer deterioration from lack of investment. And there's a sort of slight expected loss of housing just over time from these factors. And it increases the older the house is, the more likely there are to be a kind of a destructive event. And then finally, removal. Houses get torn down all the time to make way for parking, to make way for new public facilities, parks, community centers, public works of various kinds, widening of highways, expressways, businesses that expand, businesses that need more space for parking. So there's actually a pretty big component of this, which is about the removal of housing for growth. And again, the older the neighborhood, the less likely that neighborhood is to have been built with total car use in mind. And the more likely it is to have experienced some level of housing removal just to sort of accommodate changing trends in society and the increasing size and use of cars in particular. So that's a second driver of population loss. It's just the change in our built environment that gradually chips away at the housing stock. And then the third and the most kind of serious form of population loss is household loss, is a loss of demand to live in a particular place. So population will fall if there are insufficient number of households that are either interested in or have sufficient income to occupy the housing in a neighborhood. And this, of course, is what Detroit has seen on a widespread scale, is that it's not possible to fill all of the housing in the city. There's insufficient demand for that housing. And my colleague, now emeritus, George Galster, has written about this very well. He argues, and I think he's right, that at a regional scale, in Metro Detroit in particular, but you see this elsewhere in the Rust Belt and other parts of the country, we're simply overbuilding relative to the number of houses, relative to the number of households. And this has been true for decades, for many, many years, right? So we're sprawling as a region, and we keep generating new housing, which is attractive to folks. But just as a pure math problem, it means that some housing in the older parts of the region is going to be left vacant because there just aren't enough households to occupy it all. Which households are going to be left vacant? They're not randomly distributed. It's not a few here in Birmingham and a few here in Bloomfield Hills and a few here in Detroit. The houses that are kind of permanently vacant because they lack sufficient demand are concentrated in particular neighborhoods that are stigmatized in some way, or that are perceived as being the lowest quality or the least desirable. Kind of close out this kind of theoretical portion. So why are some neighborhoods seen as undesirable or as stigmatized? Well, this partly relates in kind of the kind of facts of quality of life, right? So there may be dilapidated housing. There might be elevated levels of crime, noise, right? If there's perceptions of a place as being unsafe or undesirable, fewer people will want to live there. But we also know that prejudice and implicit bias play a really important role in shaping people's perceptions of a neighborhood. So a neighborhood that actually might be higher quality could be perceived as lower quality based on who lives there, rather than any like actual fact about the quality of life there. And we have consistently seen in this region, and again throughout the country, that neighborhoods that are predominantly Black have lower housing values relative to other neighborhoods with the same characteristics in terms of like physical characteristics, because there are fewer people interested in moving into them due to prejudice and implicit bias. And the same could be applied to some other groups, including neighborhoods that are kind of stereotyped as being poor, for example. In the neighborhoods that are the most likely to kind of have this status, the stigmatized status, and to be stuck in that place are those that are low income, that are predominantly Black, and they receive both less public investment and less private investment, because the households that live there tend to be poorer. There tend to be more kind of predatory landlords, more speculation that's damaging to property and to livelihood. And then there's also an insufficient tax base. And there's a reluctance of banks and other financial institutions to lend in the neighborhood with these kind of characteristics. So while we've officially banned redlining in the United States, but there's many respects in which that label would still apply. So I think that these kind of factors together will explain substantially the patterns I'm going to show you, that Metro Detroit really has been kind of primed for population loss for a very long time, because we do indeed have shrinking family sizes and aging population. Those trends hold here. We have widespread housing losses, particularly in older communities, due to the expansion of industrial businesses, the proliferation of parking lots, the widening of roads. So there's a substantial amount of just housing loss, kind of intentional housing loss. And then we have excess housing in the region because we keep sprawling, but we don't actually have rising demand for housing in Metro Detroit. We have a pretty flat regional population. We don't have a very strong economy. We don't have a huge flow of immigrants. And so there isn't much incentive in older neighborhoods to do more infill housing or to create additional units out of the housing that exists. There's a kind of built-in momentum toward kind of gradual dispersion rather than reinvestment. And additionally, we of course have a long history of structural racism and prejudice in this region, which tends to mean that the neighborhoods that are experiencing this process of disinvestment are most likely to be those that are majority Black. So that's kind of my preface to this all. That's how I think about what I'm seeing. What are the actual patterns in the data? So first, let me tell you about kind of how I did the analysis. So compared to previous research, what's different about what I'm doing? One is that this is just a case study of one metropolitan area, and it's the one that's experienced the most population loss in the U.S. So there's a sense in which this is sort of an extreme case, and I look forward in the future to kind of having more comparative research with other metropolitan areas. I'm taking a much longer time frame. So most studies on drinking cities start in 1970 or later, because that's what has been readily digitized. That's easy data to work with. And I went back and dug through old census reports to go back to the 30s. I'm doing a wider geography. I'm not limiting it to a set of cities of a certain size. I'm covering the entirety of Oakland, Macomb, and Wayne counties. And where possible, where I have the data, I'm going down to the kind of smallest level I can to see kind of the pattern as it unfolds across the region. And I'm looking at both population and occupied housing, because it's important to realize that you can have sustained population loss without decline. And occupied housing is an important additional variable, and to see how those two interrelate. So specifically, the data sets that I've put together, and these will be shared when I publish this research. One is population and household occupied housing data, or household data, they're the same, for Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties at the county subdivision level. So every city, township, and charter township. Villages aren't separated out in that data set. They're attached to the townships that they are affiliated with. And then for 1970 to 2010, I have the same data at the tract level. And I actually have the data for going back to the 1930s at the tract level, but it's going to take some time to use it, because the key thing in working with tract level data, as well actually with locality level data, is that boundaries change over time. So you can't just pick a census tract and compare that census tract backward in time. You have to standardize the geography. You have to say, I'm comparing the exact same area in 2010 to the same area in 2000 to the same area in 1990. And so with both of these data sets, we've been able to do that to a considerable extent to ensure that we're looking at the exact same area, so that the population and household changes we see aren't just due to a city growing in boundaries or shrinking in boundaries. And then we also examined, kind of as explanatory variables, the racial composition of these communities, their income level, the age of the housing stock, and their land use. In particular, are these all residential communities, like strictly residential, or do they also include an industrial component? And I'm going to kind of pass over the data source slide. I'm just sharing this here if you're curious. If you're a researcher and you want to know how I did it, and I'd be happy to talk more about the actual data sources and how we put together the data set if you're interested. And I've written a code book to go with the data sets that explains where everything came from and the kind of decisions that we made about, how to decide, like, how many people were living in Rochester Hills before Rochester Hills existed, right? That's the challenge of going backward in time, is that these communities don't maintain the same names and boundaries across history. And so you have to make educated guesses about how that geography goes backward. Okay, so let me share with you some of the actual findings. So this is pulling from this data set of all the localities in Metro Detroit between 1930 and 2010. The first finding is that there has been kind of continuous population loss since 1930, starting in Hamtramck, Highland Park, and the adjoining part of Detroit. Basically, the parts of Metro Detroit that first industrialized when the auto industry boomed in the 1910s and 20s. So these communities have been losing population more or less nonstop. Highland Park nonstop for 90 years, perhaps actually longer than that. It seems to have started before the onset of the Great Depression. I think probably since like 1926 or 27. And they have had nonstop household loss since 1950. And furthermore, this kind of area of Metro Detroit where you see these trends of population loss, and then kind of after a 20 to 30 year delay, household loss, that area keeps getting bigger, more and more of the region. So here's the first map, again, produced by my research assistant, Andrew Jason, using the data set that I put together. And so here you see at the center, Highland Park and Hamtramck reaching their population peak in 1930. And if we had a kind of a finer data set for Detroit, you would see that a considerable part of Detroit would be colored that deep red as well. The city of Detroit and some of the downriver suburbs, have peaked by 1940, more adjoining communities by 1950, and kind of onward from there. As I said, I don't have kind of evidence on this map, but we have other data that affirms that Detroit was losing population at its core starting in 1930. So this, for example, is a quote from a planning study done by, I think, a master's student at U of M in 1933. He says, the entire Inner Boulevard area has been characterized of late years by sharp population losses. And he is relying here on a census conducted by the school board. Starting in 1925, they did these detailed studies of where all of the children lived in the city of Detroit. And so you can see a considerable loss of population within the Grand Boulevard of Detroit, which at the time was the most densely populated part of the city. And this is another map that kind of shows you what's going on in the 30s. These kind of black dots you see scattered on the edges, those are the sites of every new house constructed between 1938 and 1939. And you can see this is the exact same thing that's happening today, which is that nearly all of the additional housing being constructed is at the edge of the metropolitan region. In the 30s, the edge was, much closer to the center. A lot of Detroit still hadn't been developed. But there's no new housing construction taking place at the core, and so you would expect to see population loss there just from demographic trends alone, knowing that the number of housing units by this point is basically fixed. Here's another map kind of showing what's going on in Detroit. This is from a Detroit City Plan Commission report using census tract level data. And this is showing every community in the city of Detroit that lost population between 1940 and 1950. So we usually say Detroit peaked in 1950, and that's when it started experiencing decline. But it's very evident that much of Detroit was dealing with considerable population losses by as early as the 30s. And the reason why some of these core neighborhoods are grew between 40 and 50 is because of temporary wartime housing. As people came in and were living in like barracks and other temporary structures to work in factories, and then some of that housing disappeared after the war. There wasn't a lot of permanent new housing built in the 40s. Just to kind of put some names to this, if you weren't able to, if you don't have the map of Metro Detroit memorized, so it's Hamtramck and Highland Park peaking in 1930, Detroit, Ecorse, River Rouge by 1950, and then by 1960 you have 12 communities have reached their population peaks. And these are mostly downriver suburbs, southeast Oakland County. By 1970, it's almost all of southeast Oakland County, all of the downriver suburbs, all of the points. it kind of expands in each decade. And I can show you some of this data kind of at a summary level. So kind of cumulatively, you have 2 of the localities in the region have hit their population peak in 1930. By 10 years later, it's 5 of them, then it's 17, then it's 51, then it's 57, then it's 60, right? It's not everywhere, but it's a growing number of communities kind of hitting these population peaks and plateauing. And this roughly corresponds to the age of the housing stock. So the older the housing stock in the neighborhood, or in the community, the more likely it is to hit its population peak and go down from there. And I've also kind of put in this next column, so taking an average of the communities that fall into this category, when did they have their peak year of households, the peak year of occupied housing? And it's typically about 25 to 30 years after they have hit their peak housing. Their peak population. So population hits a cap. They still have a small increase in the number of houses in the community for 20, 30 years even. And then from that point forward, they're now losing both households and they're losing population. Here you can see communities listed by the year of peak occupied housing. So this is a somewhat kind of more severe measure of shrinkage because you can lose population and not lose housing at all. But if you're losing occupied housing, you necessarily have, you have fewer households in your community and you probably have less housing. And so here we see, again, these kind of inner industrial communities, Highland Park, Hamtramck, River Rouge peaked first in 1950. Detroit follows in 1960, and then some of the other downriver suburbs, southeast of Oakland County suburbs kind of follow forward. But many more communities have continued to add occupied housing, even though they've lost population. So this paints a somewhat less dire picture of shrinkage in Metro Detroit. So here are some of the communities that have experienced occupied housing loss for the longest duration. So Hamtramck, Highland Park, River Rouge were first, then Detroit, then it's communities like Berkeley, Ecorse, Ferndale, Huntington Woods, Pleasant Ridge, Wyandotte. And for some of these communities, the reason why they've never increased their occupied housing is because they lost a substantial chunk of their housing to highway expansion, or they lost a big chunk of it to some big factory. And so it limited the amount of residential land in those communities kind of permanently. And they also tend to be fairly small localities that don't have a lot of kind of wiggle room into where they could add additional housing. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they have declined. It just means that they were kind of truncated. In this, just to show you kind of possible explanation of some of these patterns, here you're seeing the median year of the housing stock in every locality in Metro Detroit. And interestingly, this really doesn't explain the patterns of shrinkage all that well. It's roughly correlated, especially with population loss. The older the community, the more likely it is to experience population loss over time. But it doesn't necessarily predict which communities are going to experience housing loss, and it definitely doesn't predict which communities are going to experience decline. So communities like, say, Pleasant Ridge, or or parts of the Grosse Pointes, they have beautiful historic housing that has remained middle class and occupied continuously. So they have slight population loss and they have slight housing loss, but it doesn't mean that they've experienced decline. So just the age alone of the housing stock doesn't kind of explain everything. What I think is a lot more powerful as an explanation in terms of where do you see substantial population loss and where do you see substantial loss of occupied housing is actually racial composition of the communities. So what I did in this data set is first took the kind of median, what's the average number of Black residents in the Tri-County area? What's the average number of white residents in the Tri-County area? And then I looked at the data set of all the communities and I said, okay, which communities have more than that median number? So 15 communities in Metro Detroit have a greater share of African Americans than is typical overall. Of those 15, so communities, like Detroit, Inkster, Southfield, of those 15, all but one are actively losing population. And 80% of them are losing households. And in terms of the severity of that, so on average, these communities have only 65% of the population they did at their peak. And they have only about 78% of the housing they once had. And these are substantially older communities. African Americans in Metro Detroit are living in older housing generally. The median age of housing in these communities is 1958. And 2/3 of these communities have a income level that's below the median for the region. The numbers look pretty different for communities that are whiter than average in Metro Detroit. Only 60% of those are losing population. Fewer than half are losing households. And the degree to which they're losing those things is very insignificant. So, if you look across all of those together, on average, they've lost about 3% of their population from their peak. They've lost maybe 3.3% of their housing. The housing stock is generally much newer, and most of these communities are middle class. So these are very different experiences of shrinkage based on racial composition, which aligns with what we know about redlining in this region and about implicit bias and prejudice with respect to who's interested in moving into a community and how it shrinks the pool of potential in-movers into a community. And that sets off a chain reaction of household loss due to the loss of demand for living there. Now I'd like to bring it down a level and show you just from 1970 to 2010, the tract level data that is comparing, it uses 2010 boundaries and compares that same geography backward in time to 1970. What you see is the places that have really experienced severe housing loss, it's usually due to housing removal. It's due to expansion of industry, so like an auto plant doubling in size, or an airport or a highway, or it is due to household loss. It's due to a collapse of demand to live in a place. And that's really associated with racialized poverty. At the same token, you have these prosperous residential suburbs, like I mentioned, places like Huntington Woods or parts of the Points, that are experiencing slight but continuous population and household loss without really much evidence of decline, but some problems in relation to keeping schools occupied. So on this map, this is showing you all the census tracts in the 3 counties. The census tracts marked in red have fewer housing units in 2010 than they did in 1970. So all of these, which is many tracts in the suburbs, not just Detroit, Highland Park, Hamtramck. All of these communities have less housing 40 years later than they did in 1970. Here we have color-coded them by the length of decline, so the endurance of it. So the deep red have lost housing every decade since 1970. And of course, we know from the previous data that in some cases, like in Highland Park, for example, some of these census tracts have lost housing every decade for 90 years. But the census tract data we have currently only goes back to 1970. So it declined since at least 1970. The ones in yellow have had at least one decade of growth since 1970. So here you see you kind of reflected like a wave of immigration to Hamtramck and to Dearborn. Or you can see kind of gentrification in Royal Oak or in Corktown, right? There's periods of time, some of this is sustained, some of it's a 1 decade off phenomenon of growth in some of these census tracts. This map is showing you severity of housing loss. And this is where you really see kind of extreme loss of housing. So the deep red are the neighborhoods, the census tracts that have lost at least half of the housing units they had in 1970. And here's kind of, this kind of is what substantiates what I said before, that some of this is clearly due to infrastructure and to expressways. So you see up top right, this is Selfridge Air Base. Southwest corner, you're seeing Wayne County Metro Airport. Their expansions taking housing that's adjacent to them. You can see here I-96 and the industrial corridor that cuts through Livonia. Here in Macomb County, you have huge loss of housing between Van Dyke and Mound in a heavily industrialized area. Similarly, in Auburn Hills, where there's a lot of industry. So some of it is just, within a certain boundary, you have had a transition from residential to industrial without necessarily a kind of bleeding over effect of loss of, interest in living nearby. Whereas throughout the city of Detroit, Hamtramck, Highland Park, and some of the downriver suburbs, you see a much more severe loss of housing and much more widespread. It's not just in the industrial areas, it's in all the adjoining residential areas. And these are communities, generally speaking, of color, either Black or predominantly immigrant neighborhoods. And finally, I just want to show, this is sort of an experimental map. We're working still with some explanatory data. We're looking at income levels. We're looking at the age of industry. So trying to kind of understand what's going on. Because one thing we found is that if you just layer industry on top of this map, like where are all the factories located? That's actually not that great a predictor of where extreme housing loss is taking place. But then what we did is we cut out all of the more recent manufacturing buildings. If you just look at existing manufacturing buildings that date to at least 1970, this starts to seem a lot like the patterns that we're seeing on this map of where severe housing loss occurs. So there seems to be a time lag. It's not a race alone, but there's also other factors, one of which might be the kind of legacy effects of industrialization. So in areas industry has peaked, and there's a number of things that could be going on here. It could be partly about, there's far fewer jobs on those sites as they once were, but they are still industrial. They're still unappealing to live near. There's truck traffic, there's noise, there's pollution. So there does seem to be a correspondence between older industry and adjacent housing loss and population loss. So I just want to wrap up with what I think are some possible takeaways from this. For me, the big takeaway is that we need to stop talking about kind of Detroit as a standalone example of a shrinking city, but instead think about this as a regional phenomenon. It's not driven by the political decisions made by the mayors of Detroit. This doesn't make sense with the data that you see. It's a regional phenomenon. We have to think about it in that respect and study it in that way. And the other thing that I think is important is that kind of borrowing from research on climate change, which makes a distinction between climate mitigation, like policies to stop the climate crisis from getting worse, and climate adaptation. What do you do to address the fact that change is already happening? I would take a similar mindset to shrinkage, and in particular, the problem, the crisis is abandonment. It's this loss of household interest in the neighborhood. And what can we do, to address these different types of shrinkage that are contributing to that problem? And so I'm just going to put out some examples. This isn't like a definitive list. I'm still thinking through this, but some possible policy responses to those three types of shrinkage that are taking place in Metro Detroit. So with respect to population loss alone, which is primarily a demographic transition, adaptation might require consolidating schools. We have, too many school buildings in some places and not enough in others. Increasing funding for districts that are losing population. Like right now, we tie school dollars to the number of pupils. We are penalizing places for losing students, even though they're losing students for reasons that don't have much necessarily to do with quality of education. We need to increase revenue sharing to these older communities to address these problems that kind of arise inevitably. And we need to provide more assistance to low-income households. So as neighborhoods age and experience these trends, they tend to become poorer, and we need to address the issues that arise there. In terms of prevention, these communities might want to focus on, how to attract younger families, how to kind of sustain their school-age populations, how to attract immigrants, and to the extent they can they address some of this, these demographic trends by increasing the number of housing units. So, more duplexes and apartment buildings, more infill housing, more accessory dwelling units. For places that are also experiencing population loss because of the removal of housing, so adaptation to that might say, okay, so like we've had an industrial expansion. We need to have buffering between industry or between a highway and residential. So there isn't kind of an aftershock where you didn't just lose housing, but now you've made the place less desirable to live. And again, in the residential area that remains, you could take steps toward increasing the number of housing units. You also could take a pivot away from these problems. We can stop losing space to car infrastructure if we instead invest in public transportation, in complete streets, in amenities that make a community more desirable, rather than kind of endlessly ceding space to roads and parking. And in terms of prevention, we have to look at where and when does it make sense to allow businesses to expand in this way? They need to have parking lots, the size of many football fields? We need to, address things like, how our zoning codes mandate a certain amount of parking for every business. And to stop housing loss from kind of neglect and deterioration, you need code enforcement. You need home repair assistance. You need to crack down on kind of slum landlords who don't invest in their properties. You need to deal with things like the Wayne County tax foreclosure auction, which kind of accelerates patterns of housing loss. And then finally, and the kind of the biggest and most challenging, is addressing household loss. The Shrinking Cities literature has really had a kind of blossoming of ideas about adaptation, which centers on, repairing or demolishing vacant homes and finding new uses for all of the vacant land after a community has been, experienced abandonment. We also know that we badly need to increase funding to these local governments because their tax base has disappeared. And we need to provide more assistance to the low-income families who tend to live there, so that both households and government have the capacity to make the investments they need to keep those communities livable. But I think we need a lot more attention to the prevention side of the ledger. How do we stop this endless cycle of abandoning neighborhoods with functional housing, in infrastructure that has a useful life still? So we need to do things like think of policies that can address the oversupply of housing regionally. How do we limit the degree to which we are kind of needlessly sprawling? And how do we redirect some of that investment back toward the core, rehabilitating houses that already exist or doing infill development? How do we fairly distribute funding to local governments and school districts so that we don't have kind of flourishing schools and wealthy governments in places that build new on farmland, and failing schools and failing governments in older communities? How do we provide more assistance to low-income families and to repair older housing so it doesn't reach the point of obsolescence? We saw on the map of the age of housing stock that there's no reason why housing from 1930 has to just fall apart if sufficient investment is being made through the years like it has in the points, which retains this historic housing stock. We need to address racism and spatial stigmatization. I think that's maybe the most fundamental of all, is to retain, demand for neighborhoods, even as they've experienced some level of racial transition, so that we aren't concentrating all of these problems of, about the regional housing market, kind of putting all of that burden on people of color in Metro Detroit. We need to invest more in education, in jobs, in wages for those at the bottom of the kind of income spectrum, fight predatory practices and redlining, and adopt environmental justice reform. So not concentrating kind of polluting, facilities, industry, infrastructure in these same communities that are already kind of at the bottom of the economic ladder. We're continuously penalizing the worst off communities rather than spreading those kind of bad things regionally and making sure that good stuff like parks and excellent schools are available to everybody. So that is my presentation, and I'm looking forward to questions.
All right, thank you. So this concludes the presentation, and we're moving on to the Q&As. Feel free to raise your hand and unmute your mic if you have a question, or you can drop a question in our chat box below. So feel free.
Hi, this is Jerry Heron. Wonderful presentation, full of data, great ideas. Thank you for a fine piece indeed. I wonder if you have any creative ideas about the fact that many of the good proposals you make about remediating the shrinkage would depend upon some kind of regional governmental authority. Absent a regional governmental authority, do you have any creative ideas about where one might go to begin facilitating the implementation of your good proposals?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's very challenging. The issue that I've been most involved with personally is trying to fund a regional transit authority for Metro Detroit. And it's a very difficult thing because, these kind of issues sort of, some of this falls along kind of partisan lines, and the Michigan the Michigan Senate has been in Republican control longer than I personally have been alive. There has not been a day in 35 plus years when Democrats were in control of Michigan government, completely. And so any kind of legislation that has passed to address regional issues like these, has to have bipartisan support from, and it's hard to come by. I think there's a little bit of hope in redistricting to try to kind of reapportion at the state level kind of who's in Lansing. But I do think it's a huge challenge. We don't have regional government. We don't have much hope of regional government. The one thing I think that I have some faith in is the fact that if you look at these kinds of maps I'm producing, like if we regionalize the discussion of these problems, I think it will become clearer to a broader swath of at least the inner ring suburbs, some of these older communities, that they are facing some of the exact same problems that Detroit faced. Maybe at a lag, maybe not as severely, but that there ought to be points of convergence where Detroit can go to Lansing with the same agenda as the points in Birmingham and Huntington Woods and the downriver suburbs, and kind of have a united front on some of these issues and say, we're all dealing with an aging housing stock. We're all suffering from the endless sprawl in northern Macomb County and far out west in Wayne and Oakland. Like, can we stop, are there ways we can reinvest collectively and move it beyond like Detroit needs more money?
Thank you.
I see.
I have a question. This is
okay.
This is Kami Podakuchi. May I ask a question?
Yes.
Sure.
Hi, Cooper. Very interesting presentation. Thank you. Could you speak a little bit about how your work is different from, say, earlier studies that have similar proposals, like, for example, Myron Orfield's Metropolitics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they're very complementary. It's just sort of taking a different approach to it, or adding an additional layer of data. And one of the things I would like to do as I wrap up is actually reread Myron Orfield's work in particular, as well as some others. So like, I've been thinking about, say like the research literature by, I don't know, something like William Julius Wilson, who is writing about like the underclass, or Douglas Macy and American apartheid. Like to what extent is the Shrinking Cities literature kind of replicating previous angles, dealing with these metropolitan problems? I think there's substantial overlap, but I hope that by kind of taking a new approach and adding this variable in, more attention to the housing market and to household and population loss, that at least kind of layers on or adds an additional constituency concerned about these problems.
Drew Irvin had put up his hand, so I don't know if Drew wants to unmute himself and ask his question.
I was actually giving a thumbs up to the previous question about making it more of a regional discussion, but I could add, Cooper, I guess I'm just thinking about this as like a communications challenge, and as outside of forums like this or political circles, do you see any big opportunities for bringing that discussion to a regional scale?
Kind of like how to have this conversation in a big public way.
Yeah, maybe, or encourage people to put pressure on their lawmakers.
That's a good question. I don't have a ready answer for you. I know that I'm not doing enough, but I would be happy to talk to anybody who wants to see this, and kind of take it to another scale. I think that it's always a challenge for us as academics. I barely have time to, teach my classes and do my research and, eat 3 meals and get enough sleep every day. But I do think that this is stuff that needs to be seen beyond our classrooms, and certainly beyond the obscure journals we publish in.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
There's a question in the chat from Michael Gruder. He said, I liked that you mentioned environmental racism, but also this fact has created other problems. How can we overcome it?
I'm afraid that's too big a question for me to tackle singularly, but that kind of similar to Cammie's point, the environmental racism literature is another, it has its own set of maps, its own set of data that I think has considerable correspondence. And so, one of the things I really want to do next, basically, because I'm still kind of working through explanations of these patterns, and I'd really like to kind of layer on okay, what is the geography of environmental racism in Metro Detroit? To what extent does that explain severe housing loss? Or is there something we learned here that we didn't previously know about, what is this attributed to environmental racism? Does this teach us anything new about that? Or, layering this onto Myron Orfield's work, which focuses more on schools and turnover in school districts. So I think there's a lot of kind of complementary research that could be done, trying to, see the differences in the alignment between this and other research frameworks.
I see Ronai Marsh seemed to have put her hands up. I don't know if it was to agree with the previous point, but if you do have a question, you can ask it now.
Yes, I do. Drew, that was a great question. I was thinking that myself, how can we connect with lawmakers to be able to get this going? I feel like, you can't do anything without that type of connection. But for a person that's not in Detroit, I would like to know if these industries, like I think you said, the airport and auto plants, are they still, I guess, like working places? Are they still expanding? or is just the area, the concentrated area in Detroit, abandoned altogether?
So particularly in the suburbs where you saw severe housing loss, those are active, expanding businesses. Those are busy highways, busy roads, busy airports, expanded, active plants. Within the city of Detroit, there's a lot more abandonment of industry. But I think one of the things that this project has made me think about is how different Detroit is as a so-called post-industrial city compared to some other places. So like in Pittsburgh, for example, the rivers used to be lined with steel factories. And if you go to Pittsburgh today, you can look long and hard and you will not find a steel factory. You'll find a lot of green space. You'll find some new medical complexes. It's not completely, revitalized, but they basically have hidden away the signs of that past industrial life within at least the city of Pittsburgh itself. In Detroit, the sign of failed and old industry is everywhere. We haven't really cleaned up any of it except a little bit along the riverfront. And, so we're post-industrial in the sense that a lot of those jobs have disappeared, but the land use legacy is everywhere around us. And I actually think that we probably have more land devoted to industry today than we ever have, because the remaining, factories like the FCA plant on the east side or the GM Poletown plant, they just keep getting bigger, even though they don't really employ very many people compared to what they once did.
I see that Andrew Gwynn has his hands up.
Yes, thank you again, Cooper, for sharing this research. It's been really exciting to keep up with the different iterations over the last several months and everything that you've been learning. Part of me is tempted to ask more questions about Myron Norfield and kind of the political side of what to do and possibilities for coalition building now and compared to when he was writing in the 90s. But something that you just said about Pittsburgh also kind of got me thinking too. Your research question, research design, is one of the innovative parts of the work that you're doing, bringing these questions of shrinkage and decline down a level to the census tract and looking within regions and variation within regions. One of the aspects of your research design is that this is a case study of the Detroit metro region. You just mentioned Pittsburgh, and I was wondering if you expanded, setting aside the resource and time constraints, if you're to expand this research question to look, across legacy cities or across the US, do you think that this story of kind of race plus the time lag effects of legacy industrialization would be the story of decline across the US or across cities?
I think yes, with the caveat that you need to understand the strength of the economy and therefore the housing market. So, and I'm really interested in doing this, although intimidated because putting this data set together for Detroit took a lot of effort. And I was really guided by the fact that I know this region really well. So I could look and be like, at a line in the data set and think like, that doesn't seem like Wixom, right? And if I do this same research in somewhere else, which I intend to, I think I won't have that kind of to rely on. And so I'm gonna have to think about how to kind of scale up. So with doing this, I've been thinking about places like Chicago, for example, or even New York City. I think would be an interesting place to look at. Some places I feel like you would see very similar results. I think St. Louis, for example, is very similar to Metro Detroit. And you need to look, beyond just St. Louis. You need to look at its suburbs on either side of the river, including East St. Louis. Or in Chicago, one of the mistakes people make in talking about Chicago is, again, this focus on the city itself. And they praise Chicago for the way that it didn't harm the lake. It kept all the parks and the beaches, and it did, but it just put them all further down the lake. I mean, it's as if Gary doesn't exist or the far south side of Chicago doesn't exist. So like similarly there, you see widespread population and housing loss. It's just, it's not just the south side of Chicago, but then it bleeds into the neighboring suburbs that we usually just don't count as Chicago because we don't go out wide enough. In a place like New York, again, I'd like to actually see the data and see if I'm right or wrong, but in 1970s, it felt like New York City was Detroit, the same sort of story going on. The South Bronx is burning. Parts of Brooklyn are emptying out. We've, of course, had a huge reversal there. And so it'd be interesting to see, like, I would imagine that the patterns you would see would look really similar up until about 1980. And then you would start to see a reversal of these trends as the economy booms, immigration flows in. If the housing market is one of scarcity instead of excess, then I think a lot of this stuff doesn't play out in the same way.
Thank you.
If there are no more questions, then we have to thank Patrick for a fantastic talk. And if you enjoyed the talk and you enjoy the format within which it was delivered, you might be tempted, and I hope you are, to open our call for speakers ad that we put in chat, because currently we are recruiting speakers for next year's Brown Back series. And I'd be grateful if you would consider that. If you don't have a title yet for your talk, but you would like to participate, you can also send us your name and your choice of semester and day. But thank you so much, Patrick, for a fantastic talk and supported with lots of data. Kennedy has a little thing she says at the end, so I let her speak, and then you will get a chance to have the last word.
Yes, thank you so much for a well-crafted talk and being able to facilitate some meaningful discussion. Hopefully you got some good feedback. We're just so very thankful to have speakers like you to come and give you the platform to share this research. We definitely want to know like some follow-up into hopefully you can apply for next year so we can have you back. But again, thank you. And as a small token of our gratitude on behalf of the Humanities Center, we do have a couple gifts for you. We have a journal and a mask with our Humanities Center logo. We'll be reaching out to you towards the end of the semester to safely get these gifts to you because of COVID. But again, thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for coming and joining us and again, engaging in some meaningful discussion. That's what we do at the Humanities Center. So it's what it's all about. And if you don't have any last words, or if you do, feel free.
Thank you. I really appreciate the chance to share my work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So this has been recorded. So if you guys want to go back, if you missed anything or have any questions about anything pertaining to the presentation, it will be edited and uploaded to our website towards the end of the week. And of course, you can reach out to our speaker as well. Again, Dr. Edwards did say we are currently recruiting. We do have the application in our chat. Just fill it out. No worries if you don't have a title or topic just yet. Just put to be announced and I'll reach back out to you. But again, thank you so much. You all have a wonderful day, and we'll be having a talk tomorrow and every Tuesday and Wednesday, same link and time. So, all right, everyone have a good one. Dr. Edwards, if you just want to stay after so we can chat for a bit, but everyone else have a wonderful day. Thank you.